That winter night in 1979, a boarding school ran the way it always did. Lights out, corridors still, radiators hissing, until a bell rang in an hour it never rang. No one moved quickly. No alarm sounded. Morning arrived with 3 beds perfectly made, slippers still lying under frames, coats untouched in a rack, and no footprints beyond the windows except smooth snow. Staff checked doors, searched bathrooms, reread the night log, and kept voices low. The day continued on schedule, classes, meals, prayers, while 3 empty seats stayed empty and the campus gates remained closed. That was the detail people remembered years later, the one that returned in fragments of dreams and late-night conversations, the sound that didn't belong to the hour it echoed through. Boarding schools are built on routines, so rigid they become invisible. Bells mark the day like punctuation marks. Wake, study, eat, pray, sleep. When a bell rings outside that order, it doesn't just interrupt silence. It fractures certainty. On that winter night in 1979, long after the last lights were meant to be out, the bell's hollow toll drifted across stone courtyards and frost-hardened lawns, slipping through cracked windows and settling into the minds of boys who lay awake in narrow beds, staring at ceilings darkened by age and varnish. Some thought it was a mistake. Others assumed it was punishment coming for someone else. No one imagined it was an announcement of absence. The school sat far from any town worth mentioning, a place chosen deliberately for its isolation. Pines crowded its perimeter like sentries, their branches heavy with snow that swallowed sound. Even during the day, the grounds felt muted, as if the world beyond the iron gates had agreed to keep its distance. At night, that distance became absolute. The buildings stood shoulder to shoulder, thick-walled and austere, their windows glowing faintly like watchful eyes. Inside, radiators hissed and pipes knocked, old sounds that blended into the background of institutional sleep. When the bell rang, a dormitory supervisor paused mid-step in a corridor that smelled of polish and damp wool. Somewhere else, a boy turned over and pulled his blanket tighter, annoyed but unconcerned. In the administrative wing, a single light burned in an office where paperwork waited for morning. Nothing moved fast. Nothing rushed to meet the sound. That, too, would matter later. By morning, the bell was already being rewritten in memory. Some would insist it never rang at all. Others would say it rang twice. A few would swear it had been louder than usual, as if struck with urgency. Officially, it was never mentioned. What was mentioned were the beds. 3 of them, aligned neatly in a second-floor dormitory, were untouched. Blankets lay folded in the precise hospital corners the boys had been taught to make. Pillows showed no impression of heads. Slippers remained beneath bed frames, toes pointed outward, waiting. On one chair, a school-issued blazer hung carefully, pockets heavy with the ordinary way of forgotten things. Lint, a bus token, a note written in cramped handwriting. Winter coats still lined the communal rack by the door, sleeves brushing each other like quiet companions. Nothing suggested haste. Nothing suggested escape. The absence announced itself slowly, the way cold does. First as a question, then as discomfort, then as something impossible to ignore. Faculty members moved through the dormitory with lowered voices and practiced calm. Doors were checked. Bathrooms were searched. The grounds were scanned from windows that overlooked white fields unmarred by footprints. The night watch log was retrieved and reread. Its entries bland and unhelpful, noting nothing more unusual than the temperature drop after midnight. No alarms had sounded. No gates had been opened. The world outside the school remained pristine, untouched, indifferent. Someone said perhaps the boys had gone to another building, a prank, or a late-night dare. Someone else suggested illness, confusion, sleepwalking. These theories floated briefly before sinking under their own weight. The school was not a place where wandering went unnoticed. Every movement was accounted for, every deviation recorded. The idea that 3 students could simply drift away strained belief, yet belief strained itself to accommodate the alternative. Parents were not called right away. That decision would later be described as protocol, as caution, as an effort to avoid unnecessary panic. In truth, it was fear wearing the mask of procedure. The school had existed for generations on a promise of control. To admit that control had failed, even temporarily, felt unthinkable. By midday, whispers had spread through the student body like smoke. Names were passed between desks, scribbled on notebook margins, mouthed during prayers. Some boys claimed to have seen one of the missing students the night before, standing by a window, staring into the dark as if listening for something. Others recalled an argument, a warning, a look exchanged in the corridor. Memory began rearranging itself, eager to contribute meaning where none yet existed. Outside, the weather shifted. Snow fell lightly, erasing whatever trace the night might have left behind. Teachers watched it from windows with expressions they would later struggle to describe. Concern mixed with relief, dread softened by the clean absolution of a blank landscape. The grounds looked untouched, innocent. It was easier to believe nothing had happened than to confront the implications of what had. By evening, the bell rang again on schedule this time. Dinner was served. Plates clinked. Chairs scraped against the floor. 3 seats remained empty, their absence marked by nothing more than space. No announcement was made. No prayer offered explanation. The routine absorbed the anomaly and continued forward, as institutions do, dragging everyone with it. But the silence around those empty beds grew heavier. With each passing hour, the boys did not return. The night settled in again, deeper this time, pressing against the windows. Somewhere, far beyond the trees, trains passed and cities breathed, unaware that a small universe had fractured in a place designed to keep such fractures from occurring. Years later, when people tried to pinpoint the moment everything changed, they would circle back to that night, not because of what was seen, but because of what wasn't. No screams, no struggle, no dramatic evidence to cling to, just a bell ringing when it shouldn't have, and 3 lives slipping quietly out of alignment with the world that was supposed to hold them. In the absence of answers, the mind filled space with feeling. Unease became the school's unspoken companion, lingering in hallways and settling into the mortar between stones. New students arrived, unaware of what had occurred, yet sensitive to something they couldn't name. Old ones graduated and left, carrying fragments of the night with them, unsure why certain sounds made their chests tighten years later. The disappearance did not announce itself as a mystery at first. It felt more like a miscount, a clerical error the world would soon correct. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks hardened into something like permanence, the truth began to take shape in the only way it could, through absence. The boys had not been taken from their beds by force. They had not been seen leaving. They had not left behind explanations. They had simply stopped being there. And in a place built on order, discipline, and certainty, that quiet erasure was more disturbing than any chaos could have been. The school liked to describe itself as a place where boys arrived unfinished and left refined, where uncertainty was burned away through routine, discipline, and tradition. Its brochure spoke of character, resilience, and leadership, words printed in confident serif fonts over photographs of ivy-covered stone and straight-back students in press uniforms. Parents read those words with relief. In a world that felt increasingly loud and unstructured, this place promised order. It promised to shape boys into men who understood hierarchy, responsibility, and restraint. The campus itself reinforced that promise. Built decades earlier, it rose from the land with a kind of deliberate severity. The stone buildings were thick-walled and symmetrical, their windows narrow and evenly spaced, designed less for comfort than for endurance. Inside, hallways stretched long and straight, discouraging lingering. Floors gleamed with polish, reflecting light in a way that made even footsteps feel exposed. Portraits of former headmasters and distinguished alumni lined the walls, their eyes following students as they passed, silent reminders of expectations set long before any of them were born. Life at the school moved according to a rhythm that left little room for improvisation. The bell dictated every transition, slicing the day into manageable pieces. Wake-up calls came before sunrise, even in winter, when the sky remained dark and the air bit dual uniforms. Beds were made with military precision. Shirts were tucked, shoes shined, ties knotted just so. Small deviations were corrected quickly, sometimes publicly, always decisively. The lesson was clear. Individuality was acceptable only within clearly marked boundaries. Classes were formal affairs. Teachers lectured from behind heavy desks. Their authority rarely questioned. Knowledge was delivered, not discussed. Success was measured not just by grades, but by posture, tone, and obedience. A boy could excel academically and still find himself corrected for speaking out of turn or slouching in his chair. There was an unspoken understanding that intellect mattered, but conformity mattered more. Outside the classroom, the same structure persisted. Meals were taken in silence or near silence, broken only by the scrape of cutlery and the occasional instruction from a supervising master. Conversation, when permitted, stayed carefully neutral. Personal topics were discouraged. Emotional displays quietly frowned upon. Homesickness was something to be overcome, not indulged. Letters from home were private, but the act of missing home was treated as a weakness to be outgrown. Discipline was woven into every aspect of daily life. Infractions were logged, categorized, addressed. Some punishments were mild. Extra chores, loss of privileges. Others carried a heavier weight. Isolation, formal reprimands, the kind of quiet disappointment that lingered longer than any raised voice. The school did not need to shout to be heard. Its authority was constant, ambient, pressing in from all sides. Among the students, hierarchies formed quickly. Older boys held unspoken power over younger ones, reinforced by tradition and tacit approval. Prefect enforced rules with a mix of pride and resentment, learning early what it meant to wield authority. Without explanation, friendships existed, but they were shaped by proximity and survival as much as affection. Trust was selective. Vulnerability, rare. There were rumors, always rumors, though they rarely took clear shape. Whispers about strict punishments administered behind closed doors. Stories of boys who struggled, who didn't quite fit the mold, who were quietly encouraged to leave. None of it was officially acknowledged. The school's public face remained composed, dignified, untouchable. Problems, if they existed, were handled internally, absorbed into the institution's thick walls. For many boys, the experience was formative in exactly the way the school intended. They learned to suppress doubt, to perform confidence even when it fell hollow, to equate silence with strength. Others learned different lessons. They learned how to disappear into themselves, how to comply outwardly while retreating inward. They learned that asking too many questions could make you visible in the wrong way. Adults who worked there saw themselves as custodians of a legacy. They had been trained in the same traditions, molded by similar environments. To them, the system worked because it had always worked. Any discomfort was a necessary step toward maturity. Any resistance was a flaw to be corrected. Compassion existed, but it was filtered through rules, restrained by the belief that too much softness would undermine authority. The isolation of the school amplified everything. With no nearby town, no easy escape, the campus became a closed world with its own logic. News from outside arrived slowly, dulled by distance. Inside the gates, time moved differently. Days blended into one another, marked only by bells and seasons. Problems did not spill outward. They folded inward, contained. Parents, when they visited, saw only what they were meant to see. Orderly dormitories, polite students, confident staff. Any unease their children tried to express was often reframed as adjustment, growing pains, the price of excellence. The school's reputation carried weight, and that weight smoothed over doubts. To question the institution was to question the wisdom of having sent a child there in the first place. In this environment, reputation was more than pride. It was currency. It ensured funding, enrollment, prestige. It justified the rigidity, the emotional distance, the insistence that this way of life produced better men. Protecting that reputation was not a conscious conspiracy so much as a reflex, ingrained over decades. Problems were not denied. They were minimized, contextualized, quietly redirected. So when the disappearance occurred, it collided with a system unaccustomed to uncertainty. The idea that something could happen beyond its control was not just frightening, it was destabilizing. The school's identity depended on the belief that nothing truly unpredictable could take root within its walls. In retrospect, it became clear that the disappearance did not happen in opposition to the school's culture, but within it. The same mechanisms that maintained order silence, hierarchy, internal resolution, also created blind spots. They made it easy to look away, to assume explanations that preserved structure rather than challenged it. The boys who vanished had lived within this world, shaped by it in ways both visible and hidden. They had learned its rules, its rhythms, its unspoken expectations. Whether they fit comfortably within that mold or strained against it mattered less than the fact that the mold existed at all. The school promised transformation, and in many ways it delivered. But it also demanded something in return. Compliance, trust, the willingness to accept that those in authority knew best. For most, that exchange passed without incident. For 3 boys in the winter of 1979, it would become part of a story the institution was never prepared to tell. Long after the brochures were updated and the buildings renovated, that promise lingered in the air unexamined. The school continued to shape boys into men, just as it always had. And somewhere beneath that polished surface, the unanswered question remained, embedded in stone and silence, waiting for someone to look closely enough to see it. They were remembered together because they vanished together. But before that winter, they existed as 3 separate lives moving along parallel tracks, occasionally intersecting, never fully merging. The school records reduced them to names, dates of birth, academic averages. Those details survived neatly filed, long after more fragile things were lost. What didn't survive so cleanly were the quiet contradictions that defined them, the private negotiations each boy carried inside himself while learning how to belong in a place that rewarded sameness. One of them had arrived younger than most, small for his age, with handwriting that leaned slightly to the right, as if it were trying to move faster than his thoughts. Letters from home were frequent at first, then less so, not because the longing faded, but because he learned how to hide it. He kept photographs tucked inside textbooks, pulling them out only at night, tracing familiar faces with his thumb until the lights went out. Teachers described him as polite, attentive, easily overlooked. He followed rules instinctively, not out of devotion, but out of fear of drawing attention. In class, he rarely raised his hand, though his grades suggested he knew more than he let on. He listened carefully, storing observations away like keepsakes, never certain which might be needed later. Another was harder to miss. Taller, louder, with a confidence that felt practiced rather than natural. He laughed easily and often, drawing others toward him like warmth in winter. Rules bent slightly in his presence. He tested boundaries with charm instead of defiance, earning mild reprimands that never quite stuck. Teachers alternately admired and mistrusted him. There was something restless beneath his ease, a sense that he was performing a version of himself he believed the world wanted. When alone, that performance dropped. Friends remembered moments when his voice lowered unexpectedly, when jokes gave way to sudden seriousness, as if he were listening to something no one else could hear. The third lived almost entirely in the margins. He spoke softly, when he spoke at all, and seemed perpetually half elsewhere. His notebooks were filled not just with assignments, but with small sketches, geometric patterns drawn over and over until the paper wore thin. He observed more than he participated, watching dynamics unfold without inserting himself into them. Some mistook his quiet for detachment. Others sensed something sharper beneath it, an awareness that made him cautious. He was known for asking careful questions, the kind that didn't challenge authority outright, but lingered uncomfortably once asked. They shared classes, corridors, meals. Their paths crossed often enough that others assumed they were close friends. In truth, their connection was looser, built from proximity rather than confession. They sat near one another in study hall, exchanged glances during assemblies, occasionally walked the grounds together when free time was allowed. Conversation stayed surface level. Homework, minor complaints, speculation about upcoming exams. The deeper parts of themselves remained unshared, protected by instinct and environment alike. Still, there were moments that stood out in retrospect, details that seemed insignificant at the time, but later took on weight. A teacher recalled one of them lingering after class, as if wanting to ask something, then thinking better of it. A dorm mate remembered a late-night whisper, a question about whether anyone ever really left the school unchanged. Someone else recalled an argument, muted but intense, voices kept low, faces turned away from passing footsteps. None of them spoke openly about home, though for different reasons. One missed it desperately and felt ashamed of that longing. Another pretended it didn't matter, masking uncertainty with bravado. The third seemed detached, as if home existed somewhere abstract, no longer tethered to a place. Their silences overlapped but did not align, creating an illusion of shared understanding without the reality of it. In the weeks before the disappearance, small shifts were noticed, though no one knew to name them as such. One boy grew quieter, retreating further into himself. Another became more animated, almost frantic, as if trying to outrun a thought. The third spent more time alone, walking perimeter of the grounds during allowed hours, eyes drawn repeatedly toward the tree line. These changes were subtle, easily dismissed as normal fluctuations in adolescent behavior. In a place where introspection was discouraged and emotional vocabulary limited, few asked what might be driving them. There was no record of rebellion, no clear signs of planning. Their belongings remained intact, money untouched, passports, where they existed, locked away per school policy. This absence of evidence would later become a cornerstone of the mystery, but at the time it simply blended into background noise of daily life. Boys were expected to adapt quietly. Struggle, when it occurred, was internal. The letter arrived 2 days after the disappearance, postmarked the day before it occurred. It was addressed neatly, the handwriting unmistakable. The contents were brief, mundane at first, describing the weather, a class assignment, a passing joke. Then the sentence broke off mid-thought, ending without punctuation, as if the writer had been interrupted or reconsidered the act of writing itself. No explanation followed. No second page. It was an unfinished gesture, frozen in time. Looking back, those who knew them searched their memories for warnings they might have missed. They replayed conversations, scrutinized expressions, magnified casual remarks into possible signals. But memory is not a recording. It reshapes itself in the presence of loss. What once seemed ordinary now appeared loaded with meaning. What had gone unnoticed now felt unforgivable. What remained certain is that each boy carried something unspoken, something unresolved. Not a single shared secret, but parallel silences shaped by the same environment. The school taught restraint expertly. It did not teach articulation of fear, or how to ask for help without consequence. The boys learned to endure quietly, to manage their inner lives alone. Their disappearance fused them into a single narrative, but it is worth remembering that they entered that night as 3 distinct individuals, each with his own doubts, desires, and private calculations. Whatever happened did not erase those differences. It only concealed them, leaving behind fragments that refused to assemble into a single, coherent explanation. In the end, what haunts the story is not just that they vanished, but that so much of who they were remains unknowable. Not because no one cared, but because the world they inhabited did not encourage being fully known. They lived side by side, sharing space without sharing truth, and when they disappeared, the distance between who they were and who others believed them to be widened into something unbridgeable. They were 3 boys moving quietly through a system that prized composure over confession. The morning after it became clear the boys were not returning on their own, the school shifted into a version of motion that looked like action but felt like hesitation. Doors were opened, then closed again. Meetings were held behind thick wooden doors, voices kept low enough that words blurred into tone. The phrase, "we need be careful," surfaced more than once, though no one could later recall who said it first. Careful meant different things to different people. To some, it meant protecting the students still on campus from fear. To others, it meant protecting the institution from questions it was not ready to answer. A cursory sweep of the grounds took place after breakfast. A handful of staff members walked familiar paths, their eyes skimming the snow-covered earth as if expecting something to announce itself. They checked the edge of the woods without entering it, peered into outbuildings rarely used during winter, called the boys' names once or twice in voices that lacked conviction. The search was not aggressive. It did not tear the landscape. It respected boundaries, visible and invisible. When nothing turned up, there was a sense of muted relief that settled in alongside the worry, as though the absence of evidence itself had been taken as reassurance. Local authorities were notified late that afternoon, not with urgency but with formality. The call was brief, carefully worded. 3 students were missing. No signs of struggle. Possibly a misunderstanding. Possibly a case of youthful impulsiveness. The officer who took the report asked routine questions, wrote routine notes. He was told the school had strict supervision, that students rarely wander far, that the boys must have left together willingly. The implication was clear without being stated. This was not a crisis, at least not yet. By the time a patrol car arrived at the gates, the light was already fading. 2 officers walked the grounds accompanied by a senior staff member who knew exactly which routes to show them. They asked about locks, alarms, schedules. Answers came quickly, confidently. The system worked. It always had. The officers nodded, making their own quiet assessments. There was no blood, no damaged property, no obvious trail leading away. In the absence of chaos, there was little to justify escalation. Parents were still waiting for calls that had not come. Some sensed something was wrong before they were told, an unease that crept in without explanation. When the notifications finally went out, they were framed gently, almost reassuringly. The boys were missing, yes, but there was no indication of danger. The school was handling it. Authorities had been informed. There was no need to panic. Panic, however, has a way of slipping past careful language. Parents arrived anyway, driving through the night, standing at the gates demanding answers that no one was prepared to give. They were ushered into offices, offered tea that went untouched, told that everything possible was being done. What they were not told was how limited that effort truly was. No helicopters circled overhead. No dogs trace scent. No widespread alert went out. The search remained contained, cautious, almost polite. Within days, a narrative began to take shape, not through evidence but through repetition. The boys were likely runaways. Intelligent, resourceful, perhaps influenced by one another, perhaps reacting to the pressures of school life. The theory fit neatly into existing assumptions and relieved the institution of immediate culpability. It also shifted responsibility away from the present and into the unknowable future. If the boys had chosen to leave, then the school had not failed. It had simply been outgrown. That classification changed everything. Search efforts slowed, then narrowed. Official paperwork reflected the new tone. Concern became observation. Urgency became monitoring. The case was not closed, but it was no longer open in the way that mattered. The absence of visible grief within the school walls reinforced the idea that this was a temporary disruption, not a catastrophe. Students were instructed not to speculate. Classes continued. Exams were scheduled. The empty desks remained for a time, then were reassigned. Life pressed forward with the determination of routine, smoothing over the rough edges of uncertainty. Some boys obeyed eagerly, grateful for distraction. Others complied out of habit. A few watched quietly, noting how quickly absence could be absorbed. Behind the scenes, documentation piled up. Forms were filled out, statements taken. Each record was precise, restrained, stripped of emotion. Dates, times, locations. Nothing that could not be quantified. What could not be quantified, fear, doubt, guilt, was left out entirely. The official story hardened not because it was proven, but because it was convenient. For the families, the contrast was unbearable. Outside the school, time behaved differently. Each day stretched and warped, filled with phone calls that went unanswered, tips that led nowhere, hope that flared and dimmed without warning. They pressed for broader searches, for public appeals, for anything that might suggest the world was taking their loss seriously. They were met with sympathetic nods and procedural explanations. Resources were limited. Evidence was thin. The boys were likely alive. That word, likely, became both a comfort and a curse. It allowed the imagination to wander, to construct futures in which the boys resurfaced older and wiser, with stories to tell. It also delayed the reckoning that might have come with a more forceful response. As long as the boys were considered likely to return, the urgency to find them remained muted. Within the school, a different silence took hold. Teachers avoided mentioning the disappearance unless pressed. When they did, their words were careful, almost scripted. Students learned quickly which questions led to tight smiles and subject changes. The lesson was subtle but clear. Dwelling on absence was disruptive. Better to move on. Years later, those early days will be scrutinized for signs of negligence or concealment. In the absence of answers, stories rushed in to fill the space. They moved through the school the way drafts move through old buildings, slipping under doors, traveling along corridors, changing shape as they went. No one could say exactly where the first rumor began. It may have started with a whisper in a dormitory after lights out, or a half-formed thought shared between boys who sensed that silence itself was being enforced. What mattered was not origin, but persistence. Once the official explanations settled into place, unofficial ones bloomed quietly in their shadow. Students spoke in fragments, careful never to raise their voices. Someone claimed the boys had been seen near the far edge of the grounds late that night, standing where the tree line thickened and the school's authority thinned. Someone else insisted they'd overheard an argument between one of the boys and a staff member days earlier, sharp enough to linger. Another story suggested a hidden passage beneath one of the older buildings, sealed off years ago, but still accessible to those who knew where to look. Each version contradicted the last, yet all shared a common feature. They placed the truth somewhere just out of reach. Teachers heard these whispers too, though few acknowledged them. When they did, it was only to dismiss them as imagination, stress, youthful exaggeration. The official stance remained unchanged. The boys had left of their own accord. Anything else was speculation. That word became a tool, wielded to cut short conversations before they grew uncomfortable. Speculation was dangerous. Speculation undermined order. Yet speculation persisted precisely because the records were so empty. The case file, such as it was, contained little beyond initial reports and procedural notes. Dates lined up neatly. Times were approximate. Witness statements were brief, often frustratingly vague. No follow-up interviews were logged after the first weeks. No internal incident reports were attached. For an institution that documented everything from tardiness to uniform violations, the lack of detail felt conspicuous. Former students who returned years later described the same sensation. An awareness that something had been removed, not just forgotten. Archives were complete in every other respect. Yearbooks sat in tidy rows. Disciplinary logs were meticulous. Even trivial matters were preserved. But when it came to the disappearance, there was a gap that refused to be explained by oversight alone. That gap gave rumors room to breathe. One story circulated about a late-night meeting, hastily convened after the disappearance, involving senior administrators and trustees. According to those who repeated it, voices were raised behind closed doors, decisions made that prioritized discretion over disclosure. Another rumor suggested an internal report existed, documenting concerns raised about one of the boys before he vanished, concerns that never reached parents or police. No one could produce proof. The rumor survived on repetition, reinforced by the simple fact that no one ever convincingly disproved them. Silence itself became suspicious. Questions were met with deflection. Requests for information were redirected. Over time, people learned which topics triggered discomfort and learned to avoid them. The school did not issue threats or ultimatums. It didn't need to. Its authority was cultural, not coercive. Those who belonged understood instinctively where the boundaries lay. As years passed, the rumors changed shape. New students inherited them secondhand, stripped of specifics but heavy with implication. The boys who vanished became symbols rather than individuals. Their identities blurred into myth. Some said they had uncovered something they weren't meant to see. Others believed they were being punished, made examples of in a way that left no physical trace. The most unsettling stories were the quietest ones, the ones that suggested nothing dramatic had occurred at all, only a series of decisions made behind desks. Decisions that allowed disappearance to masquerade as choice. The records remained silent on all of it. Requests made decades later for access to archive materials were met with partial compliance. Files were missing, boxes mislabeled, pages redacted with broad, heavy strokes that obscured more than they revealed. Each omission felt intentional, even if no one could say by whom. The official explanation was always the same: time, misplacement, administrative changes. The cumulative effect, however, was hard to ignore. Former staff members were similarly elusive. Some refused to speak at all. Others offered carefully rehearsed recollections that aligned perfectly with the established narrative. They spoke of diligence, of regret, of the limits of what could have been known at the time. When pressed, their memories faltered, details blurred. The past became inconveniently vague. Those who tried to reconcile rumor with record found themselves caught between too many possibilities and too little confirmation. Each lead dissolved under scrutiny. Each story collapsed into hearsay. And yet, the persistence of these stories suggested something more than coincidence. Rumors thrive where truth is inaccessible. They multiply in environments where silence is not neutral but cultivated. What made the situation more troubling was how often different accounts overlapped in unexpected ways. Separate individuals years apart described similar dynamics without having spoken to one another. The same locations, the same unnamed authority figures, the same sense that certain questions have been asked and swiftly buried. These intersections did not prove anything on their own, but they hinted at a shared experience of being quietly redirected away from something uncomfortable. For the families, these rumors were a double-edged sword. They offered hope of hidden explanations, of truths waiting to be uncovered. They also reopened wounds, inviting speculation that could never be resolved. Each new story brought with it the possibility of meaning and the certainty of frustration. Time moved forward for everyone except the families. For them, the moment of disappearance stretched outward, elastic and unrelenting, pulling every ordinary day back toward the same unanswered question. While the school resumed its schedules and the case slipped quietly into a file marked inactive, parents woke each morning with the same reflexive thought. Today might be the day. Today the phone might ring with something real. At first, their waiting was loud. It involved phone calls to police departments in neighboring towns, letters sent to officials who never replied, maps spread across kitchen tables with routes traced and retraced in ink that bled through the paper. They memorized details that others forgot. What their sons had been wearing the last time they saw them, the cadence of their voices, the small habits that felt suddenly precious. Every unfamiliar knock at the door sent a shock through the body. Every ringing phone carried a jolt of hope sharp enough to hurt. As weeks turned into months, the waiting changed shape. It grew quieter, more internal. The world around them began to move on in ways that felt almost offensive. Seasons shifted. Holidays arrived and passed. People asked fewer questions, then stopped asking altogether. The disappearance became an awkward topic, one that others hesitated to bring up for fear of reopening wounds they assumed were healing. But healing was not what was happening. The families were adapting to an absence that refused to resolve. Bedrooms were preserved like shrines. Beds remained made untouched. Posters stayed on walls long after taste would have changed. Closets held clothes that no longer fit the season, or the memory of the boy who had worn them. Some parents cleaned obsessively, as if order might invite return. Others couldn't bring themselves to change anything at all, fearing that even small alterations might somehow sever an invisible connection. Birthdays were the hardest. Each year, the math grew more painful. This is how old he would be now. This is what he might be doing. Graduation ceremonies at other schools felt unbearable, reminders of milestones that would never be reached or at least never witnessed. Friends' children grew older, taller, louder, while their own sons remained fixed in memory, suspended at the age they vanished. Hope did not disappear, but it learned to coexist with despair. It became cautious, almost ashamed of itself. Parents learned to brace for disappointment, even as they wished for miracles. They followed news stories obsessively, especially those involving unidentified individuals, convinced that somewhere, somehow, a mistake had been made and the truth was waiting to be uncovered. They also learned how isolating grief can be when it lacks an ending. There was no funeral, no grave, no formal permission to mourn. Sympathy cards slowed, then stopped. Support systems eroded as time passed, and others grew uncomfortable with a pain that refused to resolve itself neatly. Friends meant well, but didn't know what to say. The world prefers its tragedies finite, its losses contained. An unresolved disappearance resists that preference. Some parents joined support groups, sitting in circles with others who understood the peculiar agony of not knowing. They shared stories that overlapped in unsettling ways. The endless speculation, The guilt over imagined failures, the sense of being suspended between hope and mourning. Others withdrew entirely, choosing solitude over conversations that felt rehearsed and inadequate. Marriages strained under the weight of divergent coping mechanisms. One parent might cling to optimism, convinced their child was alive somewhere, starting over. The other might lean toward acceptance, try and prepare for a truth that felt inevitable. These differences were rarely philosophical. They were emotional survival strategies, colliding under the same roof. Years passed, faces aged, hair grayed. The waiting did not stop, but it slowed, settling into the background of daily life like a persistent ache. Parents learned how to function with it, how to carry it without collapsing, but it never left. It surfaced unexpectedly, in grocery store aisles, during familiar songs on the radio, in dreams that felt cruelly vivid. One mother kept a notebook by her bed, writing letters to her son she never sent. She told him about small things, a new neighbor, a repaired fence, the way the garden had changed. Writing was a way of keeping him present without needing answers. Another father walked the same route every evening, tracing a loop that took him past places his son used to like, as if repetition itself might summon something back. When anniversaries of the disappearance came around, the families marked them privately, lighting candles, sitting in silence, rereading old letters until the paper softened at the folds. The school rarely acknowledged these dates. When it did, it was with brief, impersonal messages that felt more procedural than compassionate. The distance between institutional regret and personal grief felt immeasurable. As decades passed, the parents grew older in ways they had never anticipated. They attended funerals for friends, for relatives, sometimes even for other parents of missing children. Each death carried an added weight. Another person gone without having seen their child return. The fear of dying without answers became its own quiet terror, rarely spoken aloud but deeply felt. For some, hope eventually transformed into something gentler and sadder. Not belief in a specific outcome, but a wish for understanding, for acknowledgement, for the story to be told honestly even if it could not be fixed. Others never let go of the belief that their child would walk to the door one day, older but recognizable, carrying an explanation that would make sense of everything. The world continued to change around them. Technology advanced. Records digitized. New generations grew up unfamiliar with the case. Yet the families remained tethered to that winter night, measuring time not in years but in distance from the last moment of certainty. What united them was not agreement about what had happened, but endurance. They had learned how to live with a question mark, where a future should have been. They had learned how to love someone who existed now only in memory and possibility. They had learned that waiting, when stretched across a lifetime, becomes a form of devotion, and so they waited, not always actively, not always with expectation, but with a fidelity that never entirely faded. Even as bodies aged and voices softened, the bond remained intact, anchored in the simple, unyielding truth that their sons had mattered and had been lost to silence that no amount of time could fully erase. The case did not return to life because someone went looking for it. It resurfaced the way buried things sometimes do, by accident, through the slow erosion of time and the carelessness of systems that assume forgetting is permanent. Decades had passed since the boys vanished, long enough for their names to fade from public memory, long enough for school to renovate buildings and rebrand its legacy without ever mentioning the winter of 1979. What remained of the disappearance lived in filing cabinets no one opened anymore, in boxes stacked behind newer boxes, in labels written by hands that no longer worked there. The discovery began on an ordinary afternoon, the kind that rarely announces its significance. An archive room was being reorganized, its contents prepared for digitization or disposal, depending on perceived value. Dust coated everything. The air smelled of old paper and neglect. Files were sorted according to a system that had been revised multiple times over the years, each revision layering new logic over old habits. Mistakes were inevitable. One box, heavier than expected, was pulled from a shelf marked with a category that didn't quite fit its contents. Inside were folders tied with string, their tabs yellowed and curling. Most contained routine material, correspondence, meeting minutes, internal memos about long-forgotten issues. Near the bottom sat a thin folder, its label typed rather than handwritten, its date range oddly specific. It did not belong with the others. That was the first clue, though no one recognized it as such yet. The person who opened it was not searching for answers. They were junior, recently hired, tasked with cataloging and scanning without context. Curiosity, not intention, guided their hands. The documents inside were few, but their tone was different, more formal, more guarded. They referenced events indirectly, assuming familiarity the reader did not have. Names appeared that matched nothing in the surrounding files. And then there was a date that made the reader pause, because it aligned too closely with something half-remembered, something whispered rather than documented. At first, the file felt like a mistake, a misfiled collection of unrelated papers. But the more was read, the clearer it became that the misplacement was deliberate. Cross-references pointed to documents that were not present. Margins held annotations that raised questions without answering them. A brief summary page referred to an internal matter that had been resolved administratively, language vague enough to conceal almost anything. The archivists did what they were supposed to do. They flagged the file for review and moved on, but unease lingered. There was something about the phrasing, the omissions, the careful neutrality that felt practiced rather than accidental. Curiosity followed them home. That night, they searched the school's publicly accessible history, its press mentions, its notable events. Nothing appeared. No mention of disappearances. No footnotes. No archived news clippings linked to the year in question. The next day, they returned a file. This time, they read more slowly. A name surfaced again. This time paired with a role that no longer existed under the same title. Another document mentioned a meeting that, according to official records, had never occurred. The language was cautious, legalistic, as if written with the assumption that it might one day be read by someone it was not intended for. What made the file unsettling was not what it said, but what it implied. It suggested awareness without acknowledgement, concern without escalation. It hinted at something that had required attention, discussion, and resolution, yet left no visible trace elsewhere. The archivists again understand that this file had been kept separate, not because it was unimportant, but because it was... They mentioned it to a supervisor, carefully, without accusation. The response was polite but evasive. The file was old. Context was missing. It was probably nothing. Best to catalog it and move on. But the suggestion carried an undercurrent of discomfort, a subtle warning disguised as reassurance. This was not material anyone was eager to revisit. That might have been the end of it, if not for one detail that refused to be ignored. A single line referenced an external communication that should have generated a corresponding record. It did not. Either the record had been destroyed, or it existed somewhere else entirely. Both possibilities were troubling. The archivist began looking quietly, outside official channels, cross-checking dates and names against publicly available information. That was when the connection became undeniable. The date aligned precisely with the night 3 boys disappeared from the school. The names matched administrators who had been in positions of authority at the time. The language, once abstract, took on weight. The case had not been reopened by decree or public demand. It had been nudged awake by a paper trail that never meant to resurface. The realization brought with it a complicated mix of excitement and dread. To uncover something buried is to inherit responsibility for what comes next. Word spread cautiously. A journalist with an interest in institutional accountability was contacted. A former investigator, long retired, was shown copies of the documents. Each reaction followed the same pattern. Initial skepticism, followed by quiet focus. The file did not offer answers. It offered direction. It suggested that the disappearance had intersected with internal processes in ways never disclosed. For the families, the news arrived cautiously, wrapped in disclaimers. Reading the file did not feel like uncovering a secret so much as stepping into a room where a conversation had been interrupted and never resumed. The documents did not shout. They did not accuse. They spoke in the careful, neutral language of institutions accustomed to protecting themselves. Every sentence seemed weighed, calibrated to acknowledge just enough without committing to anything that could not later be denied. What emerged was not a revelation, but a slow, destabilizing realization that the story everyone thought they knew had been shaped by omission rather than ignorance. The first pages were deceptively ordinary. Internal correspondence neatly formatted, referencing dates and names without elaboration, but patterns emerged quickly. The same individuals appeared again and again, their roles shifting slightly depending on context. Words like concern, review, and consideration surfaced repeatedly, clustered around the same narrow window of time. The night of the disappearance was never described directly. Instead, it hovered in the background, implied by proximity, by what came before and after. One memo referenced an instant of relevance to student welfare, a phrase so broad it could have meant almost anything. Another mentioned the need to limit external escalation until internal clarity is achieved. There was no explanation of what clarity meant, only the assumption that it was attainable without outside involvement. The language suggested urgency restrained by caution, as if the writers were negotiating with themselves about how much acknowledgement was safe. What was most unsettling was the tone. It lacked surprise. There was no sense of shock or disbelief, no indication that the disappearance had been wholly unexpected. Instead, the documents read like continuations of an ongoing concern, as though the event had fit into an existing framework rather than shattering it. That alone challenged a long-standing narrative that the boys had simply vanished without warning. As the pages were examined more closely, contradictions surfaced. Dates did not always align with official timelines. Meetings were referenced that had no corresponding entries in public records. One document summarized a discussion that, according to the school's own logs, could not have occurred because the participants were supposedly elsewhere. These inconsistencies were subtle, but they accumulated, creating a sense that two parallel histories existed, one visible, one concealed. A particularly troubling page listed a set of recommendations. They were not dramatic. No mention of law enforcement beyond what had already occurred. No call for emergency measures. Instead, the recommendations focus on communication strategy, internal review, and reputational risk. Phrases like maintaining institutional stability and avoiding speculative narratives appeared more than once. The absence of any explicit reference to the missing boys as individuals was striking. They were referred to obliquely as factors, variables, liabilities. One line, buried near the end of a paragraph, changed everything for those who read it carefully. It stated that the matter was not without precedent. No further explanation followed. The phrase hung there, unsupported, refusing to clarify itself. It implied history, repetition, something earlier that had been managed similarly and survived. That implication alone forced a reevaluation of everything that had come before. The file did not contain proof of wrongdoing in the way people often imagine it. There were no confessions, no direct orders to conceal evidence, no explicit statements of guilt. What it contained was evidence of mindset, a way of thinking that prioritized containment over confrontation, discretion over disclosure. It revealed a system that responded to crisis not by seeking truth at all costs, but by calculating acceptable exposure. As more people were allowed to review the documents, reactions varied. Some saw ambiguity and urged restraint, warning against reading too much into incomplete records. Others felt a quiet anger build with each page, recognizing familiar patterns of institutional self-preservation. For the families, the experience was almost unbearable. To see their children reduced to abstract concerns, to realize that discussions had taken place without their knowledge while they were begging for answers, reopened wounds that had never fully healed. The file reframed the disappearance not as an unsolvable mystery, but as an event that had been actively managed. That distinction mattered. It suggested that the absence of answers was not merely the result of time or chance, but choices made deliberately in the early days when intervention might have mattered most. Attempts were made to contextualize the language. Former administrators insisted that such phrasing was standard, that risk assessment did not imply indifference. They spoke of legal obligations, of uncertainty, of the dangers of acting without evidence. Their explanations were polished, familiar. What they could not explain was why the existence of these discussions had never been disclosed, even years later, when doing so could no longer threaten immediate stability. As the tension intensified, additional fragments surfaced, not full documents, but references, acknowledgments of things that should have existed but did not, a missing attachment, a cited report that could not be located. Each absence reinforced the sense that the file was not an anomaly, but a remnant of a larger body of material that had been selectively preserved. The most painful realization for the families was not that mistakes had been made, but that concern had been present and contained rather than acted upon, that the disappearance had intersected with internal processes designed to manage perception, not rescue outcomes. The file suggested that the boys' fate had been discussed in rooms where language softened reality and decisions were filtered through reputational calculus. What changed, fundamentally, was the emotional framing of the story. For decades, the disappearance had been understood as a tragedy compounded by mystery. Once the file entered public awareness, even in its limited and carefully mediated form, the conversation shifted away from what might have happened that night and toward why so much effort had gone into controlling how that night was understood. Attention turned, slowly and then all at once, to the structures that had surrounded the disappearance from the beginning. The question was no longer simply where the boys went, but what forces had shaped the story that followed them into absence. Institutions do not think the way individuals do. They do not feel guilt or fear in recognizable human terms. They respond to threat through process, policy, and preservation. What the archive file revealed was a pattern of behavior rooted in protection of identity rather than protection of people. Reputation was not a superficial concern. It was foundational. The school's authority, funding, and cultural standing depended on the belief that it was a controlled environment where harm did not occur unnoticed. Acknowledging uncertainty on a public scale would have introduced chaos. It would have invited scrutiny not just of the disappearance, but of every practice that had preceded it. The rigid discipline, the emotional distance, the internal handling of problems. To admit that something had gone wrong in a way that could not be immediately explained would have threatened the core narrative the institution relied upon to function. Those in leadership at the time were not faceless villains. They were individuals trained within systems that rewarded discretion and punished exposure. Their careers had been shaped by the same values the school instilled in its students: composure, control, loyalty to structure. When confronted with a crisis that defied easy explanation, they reached instinctively for the tools they knew best. The result was a series of choices that, taken individually, appeared cautious rather than malicious. Delay communication until more is known. Limit speculation. Centralize messaging. These are familiar strategies in moments of uncertainty. But collectively, those choices created an environment where truth was deferred indefinitely, where the absence of clarity became normalized. As inquiries intensified decades later, the language used by institutional representatives followed a predictable pattern. Expressions of regret were paired with reminders of the limitations of the time. Responsibility was diffused across processes rather than individuals. The past was framed as a different era, governed by different standards. Each statement was crafted to acknowledge pain without accepting culpability. Legal considerations loomed large. Any admission of misjudgment risked reopening liability, not just for the disappearance itself, but for broader practices that might be scrutinized in its wake. Lawyers advised caution. Records were reviewed with an eye toward exposure rather than illumination. Cooperation was offered selectively, calibrated to appear transparent without conceding ground. For those seeking answers, this response felt painfully familiar. It echoed the early days of the disappearance, when restraint had replaced urgency. The same logic persisted. Protect the institution first, address harm second. Even now, decades later, the gravitational pull of reputation shaped every interaction. Former administrators were approached for comment. Some declined outright. Others agreed under conditions. Their words measured and precise. They spoke of the complexity of leadership, of the burden of making decisions with incomplete information. They insisted there was no intent to deceive, only to manage uncertainty responsibly. When pressed about the file, they described it as routine documentation, stripped of the significance others were assigning to it. What they could not explain was why routine documentation had been hidden for so long, or why families had been excluded from discussions directly affecting their children. Nor could they reconcile the careful attention paid to reputational risk with the relative inaction directed toward finding the boys. Power operates most effectively when it appears reasonable. That was the unsettling truth emerging from the renewed scrutiny. No dramatic cover-up was required. No overt suppression. All that was needed was the steady application of institutional logic, repeated often enough that it became invisible. The cost of that logic was borne by those without leverage, the families, whose grief was private and therefore manageable, the boys, whose absence could be reframed as choice rather than failure of oversight. Their suffering did not threaten the structure in the way public scandal would have. As journalists and investigators revisited the case, patterns emerged that extended beyond a single institution. Similar stories surfaced from other places, other eras. Disappearances minimized. Complaints handled internally. Reputation protected at the expense of transparency. The boarding school became less an anomaly and more an example of a broader cultural tendency to prioritize systems over individuals. This realization did not bring comfort. By the time the story reached this point, certainty had become a fragile thing. Decades of speculation, silence, and delayed revelations had produced not clarity, but layers, some solid, some imagined, all difficult to separate. In order to move forward at all, it became necessary to slow down and draw careful lines between what could be known and what merely felt true. This was not an attempt to diminish emotion or dismiss intuition, but an effort to anchor the narrative to what remained undeniable after everything else had been stripped away. What could be said with confidence was surprisingly limited, yet weighty in its restraint. 3 boys were present on campus on the evening in question. They were accounted for during routine checks earlier that night. By morning, they were gone. Their personal belongings remained behind. No verified sightings placed them beyond the grounds after that point. These facts had never been meaningfully disputed, even as explanations around them shifted. It was also certain that the initial response was restrained. The search did not escalate quickly. External authorities were involved late and cautiously. The disappearance was framed early on as voluntary, despite the absence of clear indicators supporting that conclusion. That framing influenced every action that followed, narrowing the scope of inquiry and lowering the sense of urgency at a moment when urgency mattered most. Another fact, now established beyond speculation, was that internal concern existed at the time. The archive file confirmed that the disappearance prompted discussion among senior figures within the institution. It demonstrated awareness, deliberation, and decision-making. Whatever uncertainties remained about the nature of those discussions, their existence alone contradicted the long-standing implication that the event had been entirely inexplicable and unmanaged. It was also clear that this information had not been shared transparently. Families were excluded from internal considerations. Authorities were not fully briefed on the scope of concern. The public narrative was simplified, not because complexity was impossible to convey, but because complexity posed risk. That choice shaped the case more profoundly than any single act or omission. What could not be said with certainty remained equally important. There was no conclusive evidence of foul play in the traditional sense. No recovered remains. No verified witness accounts describing violence or coercion. No physical trail leading definitively away from the school or into it. The absence of such evidence resisted all attempts to force resolution. Nor could it be proven that the boys left willingly, despite decades of assumptions built around that idea. The lack of preparation, the untouched belongings, the incomplete letter, all undermine a runaway narrative without fully replacing it with an alternative. The truth existed somewhere between intention and circumstance, obscured by time and choice. Attempts to reconstruct the night in detail inevitably ran into gaps. Surveillance was minimal. Records were incomplete. Memories had degraded. People remember impressions rather than sequences, feelings rather than facts. Each reconstruction said as much about the present as it did about the past, shaped by knowledge that had not existed at the time. What emerged from this process was not a solution, but a reframing. The disappearance could no longer be understood as a simple mystery awaiting a hidden answer. It had to be understood as a convergence of vulnerability and control, of individual lives intersecting with institutional logic. The boys did not vanish into a vacuum. They vanished into a system that responded by narrowing its focus rather than widening it. This reframing required abandoning certain comforts. It meant accepting that no single revelation would arrive to make sense of everything, that the truth, if it existed in a complete form at all, had been fractured by delay and discretion. It meant resisting the urge to assign motive where none could be proven, or to fill silence with certainty simply to ease discomfort. For the families, this distinction was painful but necessary. Clinging to unprovable theories had become its own form of suffering, reopening wounds without offering resolution. Separating fact from speculation did not diminish loss. It clarified where responsibility lay and where imagination had been forced to compensate for absence. One of the hardest inclusions to accept was that the disappearance might never be fully explained, not because the truth was unknowable in principle, but because the conditions required to uncover had passed. Time had erased traces. Decisions made early on had limited later possibilities. Silence had compounded itself. Yet even within that limitation, meaning remained. The certainty that the boys were not simply forgotten, not simply lost a chance. The certainty that concern existed and was managed rather than ignored. The certainty that the absence of answers was not accidental, but shaped by values and priorities that favor containment over confrontation. These truths mattered because they restored a measure of dignity to the story. They acknowledged that the boy's disappearance was significant enough to warrant attention, discussion, and care, even if that care had been misdirected. They affirmed that the family's long-held sense of something being wrong was not unfounded. What could also be said with certainty was that the story did not end when the case went quiet. It continued to shape lives in subtle ways, influencing how people understood authority, trust, and the cost of silence. The school still stood, though it no longer felt like the same place. Stone walls had been cleaned, windows replaced, paths repaved. Where frost once clung to iron railings, motion sensor lights now glowed softly at night. The name on the gate had changed once, then changed again, each revision smoothing away associations the administration preferred not to remember. To a casual visitor, it was just another historic campus, proud of its longevity, careful with its presentation. But silence has a way of surviving renovation. Former students who returned years later described a strange familiarity that went beyond architecture. Certain corridors still felt narrower than they should have. Some stairwells carried an inexplicable heaviness, as if sound itself hesitated there. Even with new paint and updated fixtures, the building seemed to remember something the people inside them did not openly acknowledge. The dormitory where the boys had slept was still in use. Beds had been replaced, mattresses upgraded, curtains changed. Yet those who knew the story felt it immediately when they stepped inside. Not fear exactly, something quieter, a pressure behind the eyes, a sense of standing in a place where absence had once taken root and never fully let go. Students who had no knowledge of the disappearance sometimes reported discomfort they couldn't explain, trouble sleeping, dreams that felt too vivid, an urge to avoid certain rooms without knowing why. These experiences were dismissed as imagination, stress, the normal anxieties of adolescence. But the repetition of them, across generations, suggested something more enduring. The ground were calmer now. The trees had grown taller, their branches thicker, casting longer shadows in the late afternoon. Paths that once felt exposed were now softened by landscaping, benches placed deliberately to invite rest. Yet the perimeter still felt distinct. The moment you reached the edge of campus, the world seemed to pause, as if asking whether you were meant to go further. No memorial marked the disappearance. No plaque acknowledged the boys by name. Official histories of the school made no mention of that winter. If you asked directly, you were met with polite confusion or carefully neutral responses. It was not denial so much as practiced omission, a silence maintained through habit rather than effort. That silence extended beyond the campus. In nearby towns, the story survived only in fragments. Older residents remembered something happening long ago, though details blurred. Some recalled police cars at odd hours. Others remembered parents asking questions that never received answers. Over time, even those memories faded, absorbed into the broader background noise of local history. And yet, The disappearance persisted in quieter ways. In the families who still marked anniversaries. In the journalists who returned to the story years later, drawn by its unresolved weight. In the archive file that refused to stay buried. The silence did not erase the past. It reshaped how the past was carried. There is a particular kind of ending that does not announce itself. No final scene. No resolution. Just continuation, altered slightly by what has been lost. This was that kind of ending. The boys did not return. The truth did not fully emerge. Life went on, but it did so with a faint distortion, a note slightly out of tune. Those who followed the case closely eventually understood that closure was never going to arrive in the form they had imagined. There would be no definitive explanation to settle every question. No moment where the story snapped into focus and released its grip. What remained instead was a responsibility to remember accurately, without embellishment or denial. Remembering, in this context, did not mean preserving every rumor or chasing every theory. It meant acknowledging the limits of what could be known, while refusing to accept the convenience of forgetting. It meant holding space for uncertainty without allowing that uncertainty to excuse inaction or silence. The boys were not symbols, though they had been turned into them over time. They were not lessons, though lessons had been drawn from their absence. They were individuals who had lived within a system that promised protection and delivered control. When they vanished, the system responded in the only way it knew how, by closing ranks, narrowing focus, and waiting for the world to move on. In many ways, it succeeded. The world did move on. New students arrived. New traditions formed. The institution endured. But endurance is not the same as innocence, and survival is not the same as truth. The silence that still lived there was not empty. It was full of decisions left unexamined, questions unanswered not because they were impossible, but because they were inconvenient. It lingered in the careful phrasing of official statements, in the absence of names from records, in the ease with which the story could be dismissed as too old to matter. Yet it also lived in quieter acts of resistance, in people who continued to ask, in those who refused to let the disappearance be reduced to a footnote or a rumor. In the end, what remained was not a revelation, but a question that refused to settle. It did not ask to be answered so much as acknowledged. The kind of question that lives quietly in the background of places and people, shaping behavior without announcing itself. The kind that changes how you listen to silence. Those who came closest to the story over the years eventually learned that haunting endings are not defined by fear, but by restraint, by the things left unsaid, not because they are unknowable, but because saying them would require a reckoning no one feels prepared to face. The disappearance did not leave behind a single moment of horror to recoil from. It left behind a slow, persistent unease that never fully released its grip. The boys did not become ghosts in the traditional sense. They did not appear in sightings or legends meant to thrill. Their presence lingered in more ordinary ways, in the hesitation before certain decisions, in the institutional instinct to manage rather than confront, in the subtle discomfort that arose whenever someone asked too directly what had happened or why. Over time, the story became a mirror. People saw in it what they were willing to confront. Some saw a tragedy shaped by unfortunate timing and limited information. Others saw the quiet efficiency of systems designed to protect themselves first. Some saw both and struggled to hold those truths together without simplifying either. What made the ending especially unsettling was the realization that nothing dramatic was required for disappearance to become permanent. No elaborate conspiracy. No singular act of cruelty. Just a sequence of choices. Each one defensible in isolation. Each one narrowing the path back to truth. The haunting was not in what happened that night, but in how easily the aftermath slipped into normalcy. As years passed, the boys became younger in memory. Their faces froze at an age that no longer existed in the present. Meanwhile, those who had been adults at the time grew old, retired, passed away. With each death, a potential fragment of understanding vanished, taking with it context that could never be fully recovered. Time itself became complicit, not through malice, but through indifference. The families understood this better than anyone. They lived with the awareness that the window for certainty had closed long ago. What they carried instead was a quieter responsibility, to ensure the story was not smoothed into something harmless, something forgettable. They spoke less of answers and more of acknowledgement, less of blame and more of truth, however incomplete. In telling the story again, decades later, something shifted. Not resolution, but orientation. The disappearance stopped being framed solely as an unsolvable mystery and began to be understood as a lesson in how absence is created and sustained, how silence can be active, how restraint can be destructive, how systems can function exactly as designed and still fail the people within them. The haunting part was not that the boys were never found. It was that their disappearance fit so neatly into the structures surrounding it that the world absorbed their absence without breaking. That life continued with barely a ripple, even as 3 futures dissolved into uncertainty. This is a kind of ending that offers no relief. It does not allow the listener to exhale and move on untouched. Instead, it lingers, asking for vigilance rather than comfort. It asks what other stories have been shaped the same way, quietly redirected until they no longer disrupt the surface. The silence that followed the disappearance was not empty. It was full of meaning deferred, responsibility diluted, truth postponed. It became part of the landscape, as ordinary and unremarkable as the buildings that still stood. And that ordinariness was the most unsettling part of all. Nothing about the place demanded remembrance. Nothing forced acknowledgement. And yet, remembrance persisted anyway, carried by those unwilling to accept that time alone should decide what matters. Perhaps that is where the story truly ends. Not with the boys themselves, but with the choice left behind. The choice to look away or to look closer. To accept silence as peace or to recognize it as something else entirely. The disappearance does not resolve. It remains open not as a case file, but as a question woven into the fabric of how institutions remember and forget. It reminds us that some truths do not surface through discovery, but through endurance, through the refusal to let quiet stand in for innocence. And so the story closes the way it began, not with certainty, but with attention, with the understanding that absence can be shaped, that silence can be constructed, and that what vanishes is not always gone. Sometimes it is simply waiting in the space between what is known and what is allowed to be known, asking whether anyone is still listening.